In the last lecture, we talked about the views of Steve Forbes and Ron Paul that the United States would be better off if it returned to the practice of backing currency with gold. Some of what motivates supporters of a return to the gold standard is concern about the power wielded by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States and those who run it. The proper role of the federal government in monetary and banking affairs was debated early and often in the history of the United States. The federal government tried twice in the 19th century and failed both times to create a central bank that would oversee other banks and maintain a national currency. The question of whether or not a national bank would concentrate too much power in the hands of too few occupied the Founding Fathers as they wrote the Constitution and considered legislation in the first sessions of Congress. The connection of this concern about the abuse of power to the use of gold as money is straightforward. If gold coins are money, then anyone who has gold has money. While mints converted bullion to coins, citizens typically had the right and sometimes the obligation to trade their bullion to the mint for gold coins. If, on the other hand, a national bank was able to issue paper money, then those who controlled the bank could increase or decrease the quantity of money in circulation without reference to the availability of gold or any other scarce commodity. That ability is power. And it is power that some of our forefathers feared. But others of our forefathers believed that creation of a national bank and paper money were essential to the development of our nation. Today, we shall see that disagreements about financial arrangements in the United States were tantamount to disagreements between competing visions for our new nation. Imagine, it is December of 1790, and you are visiting the third session of the First Congress of the United States. The ink is barely dry on the Constitution, which was adopted on September 17, 1787, but not finally ratified by Rhode Island, the last state to do so, until May 29, 1790. What will you see? What you will witness as you visit Congress on this particular day is a debate on a proposal offered by Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, to charter a national bank, the Bank of the United States, which we now refer to, as we'll see, as the First Bank of the United States. The Senate passed Hamilton's bill authorizing the bank on January 20th, 1791. The House, after much heated debate, approved the bank by a vote of 39 to 20, with most of the yes votes coming from New England, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. President Washington at first seemed to be convinced that the bill was contrary to the Constitution. He had gone so far as to instruct James Madison to prepare a veto. However, Hamilton counter-argued that the purpose of the Constitution was to set up a workable government for the United States. Hamilton argued that government had the power and the right to employ, quote, all means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power, provided that they were not precluded by the Constitution itself and not, quote, contrary to the essential ends of political society, end quote. What Hamilton meant was that the United States, in order to fulfill its potential as a great commercial nation, required financial and monetary systems that would facilitate payments and trade. Well, Washington was convinced by Hamilton's argument and signed the act incorporating the bank on February 25, 1791. The bank was located in Philadelphia. After temporary location at the Carpenter's Hall on Chestnut Street, the bank moved in 1797 around the corner to its permanent and present location on 3rd Street between Chestnut and Walnut, in a building designed by Samuel Blodgett. When you go to Philadelphia, take a look, it's still there. The forces arrayed in favor of and in opposition to the Bank of the United States mirrored, as I've said, competing visions for the evolution of our nation. So what were some arguments in opposition to the bank? Well, some opposed the bank on the grounds that the Constitution did not explicitly permit the federal government to create a bank or issue paper money. The Constitution authorized the federal government to coin and forbade the states from doing so. The Constitution forbade the states from issuing paper money, but was silent as to what the federal government might do. The Constitution forbade the states to make anything but gold and silver legal tender, but omitted to say what the federal government might do. The Constitution likewise forbade the states from impairing contracts. Now, this latter prohibition is monetary in nature because the depreciation of legal tender paper money was thought to violate contracts. Some opposed the creation of a bank explicitly because they were opposed to the issuance of paper money. They feared that paper money would invariably lead to schemes where debtors increased their wealth at the expense of creditors. Indeed, the United States had ample experience with currency depreciation. The Continental Congress issued paper money, it was called Continentals, to finance the Revolutionary War. And by the end of the war, Continentals were essentially worthless. Some opposed creation of the bank because they were opposed to the federal government setting up perpetual institutions, which they considered to be a hallmark of British government and a threat to personal liberty. An agrarian representative from Georgia, James Jackson, demanded, quote, "Was it not the ecclesiastical corporations and perpetual monopolies of England and Scotland that drove our forefathers to this country?" Some opposed the creation of the bank because they thought that it was a threat to the agrarian way of life that they believed was the best way forward for the United States. Thomas Jefferson, in particular, argued for a self-sufficient way of life that eschewed trade, especially trade for European manufactured goods. With all that opposition, could there be offsetting support? Yes. Some, and notably Hamilton, favored creation of the bank because they favored the development of a commercial United States. Indeed, one of the reasons that the Articles of Confederation proved unworkable was that individual states interfered with cross-state trade. In the Constitution, those committed to commercial activities sought arrangements that promoted trade and commercial growth. Some favored creation of the bank explicitly because they favored the creation of paper money. Why? For many rural Americans, economic activity amounted to raising crops and bartering surplus crops with neighbors. While these individuals were industrious, they rarely exchanged their labor or its fruits for gold and silver. These farmers were frightened that if taxes were specified to be paid in gold, that they might lose their lands because they didn't have access to gold. One of the complaints of Daniel Shays and those who participated in Shays' rebellion was that creditors demanded payment in gold and silver when there was not enough specie in Massachusetts to pay the claims. Some favored creation of the bank because they agreed with Hamilton's interpretation of the Constitution cited earlier. While Congress and President Washington allowed creation of the bank in 1791, a later Congress allowed its charter to lapse 20 years later in 1811. In 1791, when the Bank of the United States was established, there was no banking system in the United States. There were 4 isolated systems centered in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. But after the establishment of the Bank of the United States, the various systems coalesced into a single system that exchanged one another's obligations and maintained ongoing debtor-creditor relationships. The Bank of the United States functioned a lot like a central bank. Because of the Bank of the United States was the main government depository, it ended up as an important creditor to state and local banks. It lent those state and local banks money. And because it was their creditor, the Bank of the United States had the power to regulate local banks by pressing them for payments. Do what I want, or I'll make you pay sooner. Some important individuals did not like the discipline imposed by the Bank of the United States. Famously, John Jacob Astor of New York was furious because the bank had denied him credit. The 3rd and 4th presidents of the United States, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, had opposed the creation of the bank in the first place and had not changed their minds by the time their presidencies began. And some continued to dislike the fact that some of the shareholders in the Bank of the United States happened to be British. There was a bill to extend the charter of the Bank of the United States, and it was tabled by the House in a vote of 65 to 64 and defeated in the Senate by a vote of 18 to 17, with Vice President George Clinton casting the deciding vote. Clearly, the country remained divided, and closely divided at that, on the role of the federal government in banking and financial matters. Important constituencies continued to disagree about whether the bank was an important and appropriate source of financial discipline, or whether, on the other hand, it amounted to an infringement by the federal government on states' rights and individual rights. The forces that favored a bank tried again and succeeded 5 years later to establish a second Bank of the United States in 1860. But this arrangement did not go well. Unlike the first bank that had been ably run by Albert Gallatin, the second bank had operational difficulties almost from its beginning. Essentially, and very importantly, the second bank behaved perversely. Here's an example. A panic and a recession swept the United States in 1818. But the bank, rather than extending credit to offset these recessionary forces, was forced by its own lack of reserves to call in credit and intensify the recession, the exact opposite of what we would expect a central bank to do today. The death of the Second Bank of the United States came at the hands of none other than President Andrew Jackson, who believed that it was corrupt and wanted it to cease operations even before its charter expired in 1836. Some political analysts liken Jackson's effort to those of a gallant knight doing battle with some monster. Jackson instructed the Secretary of the Treasury to deposit federal tax receipts in state banks. Think about that. Deposit the own receipts of the federal government, not in the federal bank, but in state banks. So, not surprisingly, the second bank began to run at a loss and was converted to a regular bank when its charter was not renewed and went bankrupt several years later. So for a time, the federal government was not front and center. in national financial matters. But it's said that necessity is often the mother of invention. And as we shall see, the necessity in this case for government revenues brought the United States back into the business of banking. The time is the Civil War between the states. And the need for revenue on the part of the federal government finally settled the debate about federal involvement in financial matters. The federal government did not in particular resume control over the monetary system in the United States until the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. At the beginning of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase had on hand approximately $2 million, a tiny, tiny fraction of what Congress had appropriated to begin war preparations, and an even smaller fraction of what he thought was necessary to prosecute the war. In 1861, the U.S. government suspended payment in gold. We've seen this before in our lectures. In 1862, it issued new legal tender paper currency that were called greenbacks. Backside was green. The National Banking Act of 1863 and 1864 created a system of federally chartered banks called national banks that were supervised by the newly created Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. That office still exists. National banks were required to purchase treasury bonds as a condition of their establishment. So national banks were required to lend money to the federal government. What did they get in return? They were then allowed to issue greenbacks for up to 90% of their bond holdings. So we have a new national currency and banks can issue it if they lend to the federal government. These two banking acts also created a tax of 10% on banknotes issued by state-chartered banks. And the intent, quite plainly, was to drive state-chartered banks out of existence. Many of these state-chartered banks did convert to national banks, but some survived by accepting deposits rather than by issuing notes. According to Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in their Monetary History of the United States, $292 million worth of national banknotes were in circulation in 1867. The creation of the first U.S. dollar can be fairly said to be a byproduct of the federal government's desire for a source of revenue to finance military action during the Civil War. In the last quarter of the 19th century, two important questions faced the United States. When would it return to the gold standard? And would it permit the coining of silver? 100 years after Congress debated the question of whether to create the Bank of the United States, Congress continued to be divided on the appropriate role of the federal government in financial matters. Once again, the issue of what would be money was hotly contested. And once again, like in Andrew Jackson's time, a prominent politician became known for his stand on monetary issues. During the Greenback period, there was a dual monetary standard, with both greenbacks and gold circulating as forms of payment. But there was no fixed trading ratio or exchange rate of one for the other, because the U.S. government did not offer to exchange gold for greenbacks at some fixed price of gold. So, not surprisingly, the price of gold in terms of greenbacks rose dramatically during the years of the Civil War. Currency became less valuable in terms of gold. Gold became more valuable in terms of the currency. Once the war ended, the greenback price of gold did decline gradually, and by 1872, it was only about 10% higher than it had been in 1861. So with those two prices coming close together, it raised the question, when would the U.S. return to the gold standard? As the U.S. paid off its war debt and the greenback price of gold came closer to its pre-war level, debate was touched off about when the U.S. would return to the gold standard. And there was debate about whether the United States should allow the coining of silver as well as gold. Let's reflect on this a little bit, because this is important. From the Coinage Act of 1792, either silver or gold were legally money in the United States. Okay? So from 1792, one could have gold coins or silver coins circulating in the United States. Until 1834, however, only silver circulated as money. Why? What's wrong with gold? Well, it's a simple answer. Gold was too expensive, and people had an incentive to melt down gold coins in order to use the metal itself. Silver coins they left in the form of coins. In 1834, there was some new legislation, and it replaced the 15-to-1 ratio of silver to gold, which had been set down in the 1792 Act, with a new ratio, 16-to-1. What does that mean? Well, in 1792, a unit of value in silver had to have 15 times as much metal as a unit of value in terms of gold. So a dollar silver coin would have 15 times the weight of a dollar gold coin. In 1834, that was changed to a 16-to-1 ratio. That legislation ended silver's dominance as money and made gold the metal of choice for coinage. So, as the U.S. was poised to leave the greenback and return to a metal standard, the question was, which metal? Gold, silver, or both? The issue was settled by the U.S. Coinage Act of 1873, which eliminated free coinage of silver and cast the die for the gold standard in the United States. The Coinage Act caused little controversy when it was approved, but it proved itself to be very bad medicine for the U.S. economy during the last quarter of the 19th century. Indeed, Milton Friedman has termed the act the quote-unquote crime of 1873. Strong language. What was the nature of the crime? Gold became very scarce, with the price of gold to silver more than doubling between 1873 and 1900. The elimination of silver from the money stock caused the money supply to grow too slowly to keep pace with potential output growth in the United States. As a result, prices in the United States fell from 1876 to 1896 at a rate, on average, of 1.5% per year. Think about that for a minute. 20 years of price deflation at 1.5% on average per year. Now, this fall in prices hit farmers particularly hard, as the price of their crops fell while the price of what they bought fell less rapidly. Milton Friedman blames that Coinage Act for bad recessions that occurred in 1892 to 1894, a second bad recession in 1895 to 1896, and he blames that act for the banking panic of 1893. Increasing the money supply more rapidly through the resumption of silver coinage was a crucial issue in the presidential campaign of 1896. William Jennings Bryan delivered the famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago. Jennings said, "If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we shall fight them to the utmost. Having behind us the producing masses of the nation and the world, having behind us the commercial interests and the laboring interests, and all the toiling masses. We shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. William McKinley defeated Bryan in 1896 and again in 1900. But the silver issue continued on even into the imagination of the American people. If you've read Frank Baum's book, The Wizard of Oz, you will know that it is a monetary allegory. What's the evidence? The slippers are not ruby. That was a device of Hollywood. Dorothy's slippers are silver. And Dorothy wears silver slippers as she trips her way toward Oz along a gold-colored road. The role of the federal government in monetary affairs was, perhaps, settled finally with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in December of 1913 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve in the following year. But I find it fascinating that the proper role of government in monetary and banking affairs was debated early and often throughout our history. The federal government tried twice before the Federal Reserve Act to create a central bank that would regulate banks and maintain a national currency. Debate on the proper limits of federal authority in monetary affairs is hardly over. The Federal Reserve broke new ground in expanding the role that it took upon itself in monetary affairs during the Great Recession of 2007 through 9. Debate has raged on whether or not the Fed did too much. Let me leave you with a final question. Suppose that you had not only visited Congress, but that you had been a member there in 1791, or in 1816, or in 1863, or in 1873. How would you have voted on chartering the first Bank of the United States? How would you have voted on chartering the second Bank of the United States? How would you have voted on allowing the federal government to create the greenback? And how would you have voted on barring silver as a coin metal?